The chamber stretched across a space so vast it could swallow cities whole. 12 platforms floated in a perfect circle, each one holding representatives from civilizations that had mastered the stars when Earth's ancestors were still learning to make fire. The walls shimmered with light from 1,000 distant suns, streaming through crystalline panels that bent space itself to show the galaxy in all its terrible beauty. Sarah Chen stood in the center of that circle, her small human form dwarfed by the alien beings that surrounded her. Her gray suit looked primitive compared to the flowing energy fields and biomechanical armor worn by the council members. She was 43 years old, a career diplomat who had spent her entire adult life preparing humanity for first contact. None of that preparation had readied her for this moment. The air tasted metallic on her tongue. The translator implant behind her ear buzzed with a dozen alien languages, converting them to words she could understand. Most of those words were variations of the same concept: denial, dismissal, rejection. The human presents her case once more. The Archon of the Vrelian Concord announced, its crystalline body refracting light into rainbow patterns. Its voice held no malice, only the cold indifference of a being that had witnessed the rise and fall of 1,000 species. The Council has heard the arguments. The matter has been decided according to established law. Sarah's hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady. Established law that treats sapient beings as property. We've shown you our cities, our art, our science. We've demonstrated language, abstract thought, and technological progress. By every definition in your own codex of sentience, humans qualify as a protected species. The Zinthkar representative shifted on its platform, its segmented body clicking with amusement. The Zinthkar looked like someone had crossed a mantis with a spider, and then given it the cruelty of a banker foreclosing on orphans. Its name was Skritchix, and it had been instrumental in pushing for the relocation of humanity. Your species discovered radio transmission 127 of your years ago, Skritchix said, its mandibles clacking between words. By galactic law, any species broadcasting into space for less than 2 centuries exists in a probationary period. During this time, their star system may be claimed by established civilizations for colonization purposes. The Zinthkar Collective has claimed the Sol system legally and properly. You're not claiming empty planets, Sarah said, her voice rising despite her best efforts to remain calm. You're claiming a system with 8 billion people on it. You're talking about removing us from our homeworld. Relocation, the Archon corrected. The Primitive Species Relocation Act ensures that developing species are given opportunities to contribute to galactic civilization. Your people will be transported to appropriate worlds where they can work and learn. Work. The word hung in the air like a curse. Sarah had seen the reports from the few humans who had already been taken as samples by Zinthkar scouts. Work meant mines on airless moons. Work meant factory ships where humans would never see natural sunlight again. Work meant families torn apart and scattered across hundreds of light years. You mean slavery? Sarah said flatly. Call it what it is. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of alien sounds. Several council members expressed shock at the harsh language. Others seemed amused. The keepers, mysterious beings wrapped in robes that seemed to be made of folded space itself, remained silent on their platform. They had been silent through most of the proceedings. The Archon raised one crystalline appendage and silence fell. The Council does not engage in slavery. That practice was outlawed 17,000 years ago. The relocation program offers primitive species a chance to evolve under the guidance of established civilizations. Guidance, Sarah repeated bitterly. She pulled out a data pad, one of the few pieces of human technology she'd been allowed to bring. I have testimony here from a human named Marcus Rivera. He was taken 3 months ago from a colony ship. Do you want to know what your guidance looks like? He watched Zinthkar overseers beat his sister to death because she collapsed from exhaustion in a lithium mine. She was 16 years old. Skritchix made a dismissive gesture with one of its many limbs. Unfortunate, but labor accidents happen. The Zinthkar Collective maintains rigorous safety standards. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't her heart breaking. It was something harder. Something that had been holding back a flood of rage and despair. She looked around the chamber at beings who commanded the power of stars, who had built civilizations spanning thousands of worlds, who considered themselves enlightened and advanced. They were monsters. Every single one of them, except perhaps the Silent Keepers. We're asking you to recognize our sovereignty, Sarah said, forcing the words through clenched teeth. We're asking you to leave our system. We're asking you to give us the same rights you claim for yourselves. The vote happened quickly. One by one, the council members signaled their decision. The Vrelian Concord voted to approve the Zinthkar claim. The Metherian Collective voted to approve. The Stellar Federation voted to approve. On and on it went. 11 ancient civilizations deciding that humanity was too young, too primitive, too insignificant to matter. Only the Keepers voted against the measure. Their representative finally spoke, its voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. This council makes a grave error. The humans should be granted autonomy. Noted and overruled, the Archon said. The matter is settled. The Zinthkar Collective has legal authority to proceed with the relocation of the human species. This council stands adjourned. Sarah stood there as the platforms began to drift apart, as the representatives of 12 civilizations prepared to leave and forget about the insignificant humans they had just condemned. Something in her mind screamed at her to beg, to plead, to throw herself at their feet and ask for mercy. Instead, she found herself speaking in a voice that didn't sound like her own. It was colder, harder, carrying a weight that made several council members pause. "You should know something about humans," Sarah said. The words came from a place deep inside her, from some ancestral memory of every human who had ever been wronged and survived anyway. We remember. We remember every slight, every injury, every injustice. We tell stories about wrongs committed thousands of years ago. We pass down grudges through generations. Skritchix laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Is the primitive human threatening the council? No, Sarah said quietly. I'm warning you, humans don't forgive. Not really. We wait, we learn, we adapt. And when we're ready, we come back. It might take decades, it might take centuries. But we come back. The Archon's crystalline form seemed to dim slightly. Your warnings are noted, human. They change nothing. Sarah looked at each council member in turn, memorizing their forms, their names, their species. I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that you were warned. Years from now, when the price comes due, I want you to remember that you knew. You knew what you were doing was wrong. You knew we begged you to stop. And you did it anyway. Dramatic, one of the council members muttered. These emotional species always are. Sarah pulled out a small device, a camera recorder that humanity had sent with her. She activated it, recording the chamber, the council members, everything. I'm sending this back to Earth. Every human alive will see this. Every human yet to be born will see this. They'll know your faces. They'll know your names. They'll know that you destroyed our world because you could. Because it was legal. Because you saw us as nothing more than resources to be exploited. We're done here, the Archon declared. Security, escort the human from the chamber. 2 guards materialized, beings of pure energy held in vaguely humanoid shapes. They moved towards Sarah, but she held up her hand. I can walk on my own. She straightened her jacket, lifted her chin, and walked toward the exit with as much dignity as she could muster. At the doorway, she turned back one final time. Humans don't forgive, she repeated. You've been warned. The door sealed behind her with a sound like thunder. 3 months later, the Zinthkar ships arrived at Earth. They came in numbers that blotted out the sun, massive vessels designed to transport millions of beings across the stars. Humanity tried to fight. Their primitive weapons barely scratched the alien hulls. Nuclear missiles were intercepted and destroyed before they could detonate. In 6 days, organized resistance collapsed. The relocation began systematically. Humans were rounded up by the billions, sorted by age and physical capability, and loaded onto transport ships. Families were separated without ceremony or explanation. A mother might be sent to an agricultural world while her children were designated for factory work 3 sectors away. No records were kept of who went where. The Zinthkar were efficient. Sarah had to give them that. Within 2 years, Earth's population had been reduced from 8 billion to fewer than 200 million. Those who remained were the elderly, the sick, and those designated as cultural preservationists to maintain some semblance of human civilization for academic study. Earth itself became a Zinthkar colony. Mining operations stripped the planet of resources. Forests were cleared for alien crops. The oceans were seeded with organisms that made the water toxic to terrestrial life. Within a decade, Earth would be unrecognizable. Sarah Chen never saw the homeworld again. She was transported to a prison facility on the edge of Zinthkar space, kept alive in case the council needed a human representative for some future proceeding. They gave her a cell with a window that looked out at the stars. She spent her days writing. The Zinthkar didn't care what she wrote, assuming it was the therapeutic scribblings of a defeated diplomat. Sarah filled hundreds of data pads with information. She wrote down everything she remembered about the council, about the Zinthkar, about their technology and their weaknesses. She documented every ship design she'd seen, every piece of alien tech she could remember. Most importantly, she wrote down names. The names of every council member who had voted to destroy humanity. The names of every Zinthkar official involved in the relocation. The names of every species that had stood by and watched. Once a month, she was allowed a communication with her family. Her son, David, had been sent to a mining colony. Her daughter, Rachel, was on a factory world. Her husband had died during the initial resistance shot down while trying to defend their neighborhood. "I'm writing everything down," she told David during one of their brief calls. His face on the screen was gaunt, aged beyond his 30 years. "I'm recording it all. Make sure the others know. Make sure everyone remembers." "Mom," David said, his voice tired. "What's the point? We lost. It's over." "No," Sarah said firmly. "It's not over. It's only the beginning. They think they've won because they have bigger ships and older civilizations. But they've made a mistake. They've scattered us across the galaxy. They've forced us to learn their technology. They've given us access to knowledge we never would have gained on our own. They've made us slaves. They've made us survivors," Sarah corrected. "And survivors adapt. Survivors learn. Survivors remember." She leaned closer to the screen, willing her son to understand. "Listen to me, David. You have to stay alive. You have to have children. You have to make sure they know the story. Make sure they know what was taken from us. Make sure they know who took it." "Why?" David asked. "Why carry that burden?" Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because humans don't forgive. Because one day when they least expect it, we're going to make them pay for what they've done. It might not be in my lifetime. It might not be in yours. But it will happen." The call ended. Sarah returned to her writing. She died 17 years later, an old woman in a cell far from home. Her last words, recorded by the prison's monitoring system, were simple. "Remember everything. Forgive nothing." Her writings were smuggled out by a sympathetic guard, a member of a species that had once been conquered by the Zinthkar themselves. Those writings spread through the human population scattered across the galaxy, passed from hand to hand, copied and recopied, translated into a dozen human languages. They became the foundation of something new, something patient, something dangerous. They became the beginning of the end for those who had thought humans would simply accept their fate. Marcus Rivera was 12 years old when he first heard the story of Sarah Chen. He sat in the cramped quarters of a mining station orbiting a planet whose name he'd never learned, surrounded by 30 other humans who had gathered for what the Zinthkar called recreational period. An old woman named Grandmother Wei told the story, her voice crackling with age but steady with purpose. Marcus listened to every word, memorizing it the way he memorized the maintenance codes for the mining equipment. When Grandmother Wei finished, she looked around at the assembled humans and asked the question she asked every time. "What do we remember?" "Everything," the group responded in unison, Marcus's young voice joining the chorus. "What do we forgive?" "Nothing." The Zinthkar guards outside didn't understand the human language when it was spoken quickly and colloquially. They heard sounds, rhythms, what they assumed were songs or prayers. They never realized they were listening to lessons, to the careful preservation of memory and purpose. Marcus excelled at his assigned work. The Zinthkar overseers noted that the young human showed remarkable aptitude for understanding complex machinery. They promoted him to a maintenance role, which gave him access to parts of the station most humans never saw. He used that access to study. Every ship that docked at the station, Marcus found a way to observe. He memorized the hull configurations, the engine placements, the way the Synth-car technology functioned. He couldn't read their language, but he understood engineering. Form followed function across species. A thruster was a thruster, whether it was built by humans or aliens. At night, he would return to the human quarters and draw everything he'd seen from memory. Other humans added their own observations. A woman named Chen Wei, who had been a physicist before the relocation, worked out the mathematical principles behind the Synth-car faster-than-light drives. A man named Jackson Cole, who had been an aerospace engineer, translated the alien designs into human technical specifications. This happened on mining stations, factory worlds, and agricultural colonies across 200 planets. Humans worked the jobs assigned to them with quiet efficiency, never complaining, never causing trouble. The Synth-car congratulated themselves on how easily the primitive species had adapted to their new roles. They never noticed the networks forming. The Synth-car didn't pay attention to human cultural practices. When humans sang while they worked, the overseers heard primitive rhythms. They didn't hear the encoded messages being passed through verses and melodies. When humans gathered for what they called remembrance ceremonies, the Synth-car saw religious observance. They didn't see the systematic exchange of information and the coordination of long-term plans. On a factory world designated Synth-car 7, a human named David Chen celebrated his 20th birthday by becoming a father. He named his son James, and when the boy was old enough to understand, David told him about his grandmother Sarah. She stood in front of the entire Galactic Council, David said, cradling the small boy in his arms. She warned them. She told them humans don't forgive. What happened to her? James asked. She died in a prison, David admitted. But she made sure we would remember. She wrote down everything, and those writings found their way to us. Everything we know about the Council, about the Synth-car, about their technology, it started with her. James grew up hearing stories about Earth, a planet he'd never seen and likely never would. He heard about oceans and forests, about cities and nations, about a species that had reached for the stars only to have their hand cut off. The stories shaped him, filled him with a quiet rage that he learned to hide behind a mask of compliance. When James was 16, he witnessed a Synth-car overseer beat a human worker to death for the crime of working too slowly. The worker had been sick, burning with fever, but the Synth-car didn't care. Sick workers were inefficient. Inefficiency was punished. James said nothing. He showed no reaction. But that night, he volunteered to join a group that was working on what they called the Project. Every human settlement had a version of the project, though few knew the full scope. James learned that his particular group was focused on weapons development. The Synth-car used plasma-based weaponry, a woman named Rivera Johnson explained. She was one of the engineers, someone who had spent 20 years studying every weapon that passed through the factory. We can't build plasma weapons without resources we don't have. But we can build something better. She showed James designs for weapons based on principles the Synth-car had abandoned millennia ago. Railguns that used magnetic acceleration to fire projectiles at relativistic speeds. Missile systems with guidance computers that learned and adapted. Close-quarters weapons that could cut through Synth-car exoskeletons. When? James asked. Not yet, Rivera Johnson said. We're not ready. We need ships. We need coordination across all human populations. We need to be able to move and communicate without the Synth-car knowing. That coordination was being built piece by piece. On an agricultural world, humans had discovered that certain crops they grew produced fibers that the Synth-car scanning technology couldn't penetrate. Those fibers were woven into special containers that could hide contraband. The containers were shipped as part of normal trade between Synth-car worlds, allowing humans to smuggle materials, information, and even people. In a research facility where humans processed alien data, a man named Thompson discovered something extraordinary. The Synth-car communication networks used quantum entanglement for instantaneous communication across light years. The technology was supposed to be impossible to hack, but Thompson found a backdoor. By exploiting a quirk in how the entangled particles behaved under certain conditions, he could piggyback human messages onto Synth-car communications. The discovery meant that humans could coordinate across the entire galaxy in real time. Every human settlement could share information, plan together, and prepare for something the Synth-car couldn't imagine. 30 years after the relocation, a human named Marcus Rivera, now in his 40s, made the breakthrough that would change everything. He had spent decades studying Synthcar FTL technology, working as a drive mechanic on transport ships. He understood not just how the drives worked, but why they worked that way. The Synthcar FTL drives were efficient and safe, designed by a species that valued stability over innovation. Marcus designed something different, something faster, more agile, more dangerous. His drive system was based on controlled destabilization of the space-time bubble that allowed FTL travel. It was risky and required constant adjustment, but it could move a ship 3 times faster than anything in the Synthcar fleet. He built the first prototype in secret, using materials scavenged from a dozen sources and assembled in a hidden workshop inside an asteroid. The test flight lasted 17 seconds before the drive burned out, but it worked. Marcus transmitted the specifications using Thompson's communication hack, and within months, human engineers across the galaxy were refining and improving the design. The ships came next. Humans worked in shipyards, building Synthcar vessels and learning every detail of their construction. They worked in salvage operations, stripping down decommissioned ships and hiding the useful components. They worked in asteroid mines, hollowing out massive rocks that could be converted into hidden shipyards. It took decades. A generation of humans was born and raised in captivity, taught from birth that their purpose was not just to survive, but to prepare. They learned the history of Earth with the fervor of religious doctrine. They studied their enemies with the dedication of soldiers. They built their tools with the patience of craftsmen who knew their work would outlive them. The keepers watched all of this with interest. They were an old species, so old that their origins were lost to time. They had voted against humanity's subjugation, the only council member to do so, and they had not forgotten the humans. A keeper named Watcher of Threads began leaving caches of advanced technology where humans could find them. A mining crew would discover a container with data cores containing information about energy shielding. A salvage team would find abandoned equipment that taught them about advanced materials science. The keepers never revealed themselves directly, but their gifts accumulated over the decades. James Chen, now a respected figure among the human resistance, received a communication through the quantum network when he was 53 years old. It was a simple message, but it changed everything. The time approaches. Begin consolidation. The Remembrance Movement, as humans called their underground resistance, had grown to include nearly every human in the galaxy. They numbered in the tens of billions, scattered across hundreds of worlds, all connected by their shared history and their shared purpose. The consolidation began quietly. Humans started requesting transfers to specific worlds, citing family reunification or job opportunities. The Synthcar approved these requests without suspicion. Why would they care where their labor force was located? Humans were interchangeable parts in their economic machine. What the Synthcar didn't notice was the pattern. Humans were concentrating around key strategic locations. They were moving closer to major Synthcar trade routes, communication hubs, and military installations. They were positioning themselves in the hidden shipyards, now numbering in the dozens across remote asteroid fields and dead systems. Humans built their fleet. The ships were unlike anything in the galaxy. They were fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed with weapons that combined human innovation with alien technology. Most importantly, they were crewed by people who had nothing to lose and everything to avenge. Admiral James Chen, grandson of Sarah Chen, stood on the bridge of humanity's flagship. The ship had no official name yet. That would come later, after they proved what it could do. Around him, the command crew worked with quiet efficiency, their faces reflecting the same determination he felt. "All ships report ready," his communications officer announced. 1,700 vessels standing by across 47 systems. James looked at the display showing the location of every human ship. Decades of preparation had led to this moment. Generations of suffering and patient endurance had built toward this single point in time. "Send the message," James ordered. "To all ships, all stations, all human settlements. Use Sarah Chen's words." The message went out across the quantum network, reaching every human in the galaxy simultaneously. Humans don't forgive. The warning was clear. The price comes due today. On Synthcar Prime, the homeworld of the species that had enslaved humanity, the morning dawned like any other. The Synthcar went about their business, managing their empire, counting their profits, never imagining that they were living the last peaceful day their civilization would ever know. On mining stations and factory worlds, in agricultural colonies and research facilities, humans simply stopped working. At the exact same moment, synchronized across light years, they walked away from their posts. They gathered their families. They moved to designated safe zones, and they waited for their fleet to arrive. The Synthkar overseers tried to restore order, but the humans weren't rioting or fighting. They were simply leaving. By the time the Synthkar realized something was wrong, entire human populations had vanished from their sensors, hidden in the shielded facilities they'd been preparing for decades. In the hidden shipyards, Marcus Rivera sat in the engine room of humanity's first warship, monitoring the drives he'd spent his life perfecting. He was 67 years old now, gray-haired and tired, but his hands were steady on the controls. "All systems optimal," he reported to the bridge. "Drive cores at full power. We're ready to make history." Admiral Chen smiled grimly. "Then let's go remind the galaxy why you should never enslave a species that knows how to hold a grudge. All ships engage FTL drives. Target Synthkar Prime. It's time they learned the cost of their crimes." The human fleet vanished from their hidden positions, leaving behind only the fading signatures of their FTL drives and the beginning of a war that would reshape the galaxy. The first sign that something had changed came to Skritchix during his morning audit of labor efficiency reports. The old Synthkar administrator had served the collective for 83 years, and he prided himself on maintaining optimal productivity across his assigned territories. He noticed the anomaly immediately. Human output had dropped to 0 across 17 mining stations. Not reduced, not diminished. 0. Skritchix's mandibles clicked with irritation as he accessed the surveillance feeds. The screen showed empty workstations, abandoned equipment, and dormitories devoid of life. The humans were simply gone. He checked the security logs, but they showed nothing unusual. No breaches, no alarms, no signs of mass movement. "Impossible," Skritchix muttered. 17 billion workers don't just vanish, but they had. Across Synthkar space, every human had disappeared within a 6-hour window. The collective's economy, which had grown dependent on human labor over the decades, began hemorrhaging immediately. Mining operations halted. Factories stood idle. Agricultural worlds went untended. The Synthkar had allowed humans to become the foundation of their infrastructure, and now that foundation had crumbled. Within hours, the collective's ruling council convened an emergency session. Skritchix attended via holographic projection, his segmented body rigid with fury and confusion. "This is coordinated," the High Overseer declared, her massive form filling the center of the chamber. "The humans couldn't have accomplished this without outside assistance. Someone must be helping them." "It doesn't matter who's helping them," another council member snapped. "What matters is finding them and restoring order. The economic impact is already catastrophic." They had no idea how catastrophic. It was about to become the human fleet. Emerged from FTL space at the edge of the Synthkar, home system 3 days after the disappearances began. 1,700 ships materialized in a coordinated pattern. Their formation perfect, their weapons armed. They made no attempt to hide. They wanted to be seen. On Synthkar Prime, defense stations detected the incoming fleet and sounded alerts across the planet. Military vessels scrambled to intercept. The Synthkar military, though they hadn't fought a real war in centuries, still maintained powerful fleets designed to enforce collective authority across their territories. Admiral James Chen watched the Synthkar ships approach on his tactical display. There were 300 of them, battleships and cruisers, each one larger than any human vessel. According to conventional thinking, the humans were outnumbered and outgunned. "All ships know," Chen transmitted. "Remember your training. Remember why we're here. Remember what they took from us." The Synthkar fleet commander opened a communication channel, its translated words appearing as text on Chen's screens. "Unidentified vessels, you are in violation of collective space. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded or you will be destroyed." Chen's response was simple: no. The battle that followed rewrote the galactic understanding of warfare. The Synthkar ships were powerful, but they were designed by a species that had known peace for generations. They were built for intimidation and suppression of inferior forces. The human ships were built by survivors who had studied their enemies for half a century and had incorporated everything they'd learned. The human vessels darted through space with impossible agility, their drives allowing maneuvers that should have torn the ships apart. They didn't fight like the Synthkar expected. They didn't form battle lines or engage in traditional ship-to-ship combat. They swarmed, using tactics adapted from Earth's ancient naval warfare, combined with innovations born from desperation. The Zinthkar targeted a human cruiser with plasma batteries that should have vaporized it. The ship's shields, technology gifted by the Keepers and refined by human engineers, absorbed the impact and redistributed the energy. Before the Zinthkar could fire again, 3 human frigates had closed to point-blank range and launched railgun volleys that punched through the alien ship's hull like paper. They're faster than our tracking systems. A Zinthkar gunnery officer reported in panic. I can't get a lock. Adjust fire patterns, the fleet commander ordered. Saturation bombardment. Fill the space with plasma. They can't dodge everything. But the humans weren't dodging. They were predicting. Every human vessel had access to decades of compiled data on Zinthkar tactics, weapons systems, and strategic doctrine. They knew how the Zinthkar would respond before the Zinthkar themselves knew. The battle lasted 8 hours. When it ended, the Zinthkar had lost 2/3 of their defending fleet. The humans had lost 37 ships. As the surviving Zinthkar vessels retreated toward the planet, Chen opened a broadcast on all frequencies. People of the Zinthkar Collective, this is Admiral James Chen of the human fleet. 47 years ago, your leaders came to Earth. They took our world. They scattered our people across the galaxy. They treated us as property, as resources to be exploited. Today we've come to collect the debt you owe. On Zinthkar Prime, billions watched as human ships took up positions around their planet. The vessels didn't bombard cities or attack civilian targets. Instead, they destroyed every orbital station, every satellite, every piece of infrastructure that allowed the collective to function. Communication networks collapsed. Trade routes were severed. The space elevators that connected the surface to orbit were systematically dismantled. We're not here to exterminate you, Chen continued. We're here to teach you what you taught us. How it feels to be helpless. How it feels to watch your civilization be dismantled piece by piece. How it feels when those you considered beneath you prove to be your equals. Skritchix watched the broadcast from his administrative center 3 systems away. His entire body trembled with rage and something he'd never experienced before: fear. The primitives, the laborers, the resources had become something else. They had become an existential threat. The collective sent out calls for assistance to the Galactic Council, but the Council was slow to respond. Ancient bureaucracies didn't move quickly, and many Council species saw the human attack as an internal Zinthkar problem. Some were even pleased to see the collective humbled. The Zinthkar had grown arrogant over the centuries, and there were old grievances. Over the following weeks, the human fleet didn't invade Zinthkar Prime. They didn't need to. They simply stayed in orbit, a constant reminder of their presence while other human ships struck at Zinthkar holdings across space. Trade stations were captured or destroyed. Communication relays were seized. Supply lines were cut. The collective's economy didn't just slow, it stopped. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session for the first time in 300 years. All 12 member species sent their highest representatives, and for the first time in the Council's recorded history, they invited a 13th party to address them. Admiral James Chen stood in the same spot where his grandmother had stood 47 years earlier. But the circumstances could not have been more different. This time, a fleet of 2,000 human warships waited just outside the system. This time, the galaxy had watched the Zinthkar collective crumble. This time when Chen spoke, they listened. Honored council members, Chen began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of suffering. I come before you not as a supplicant, but as the representative of a civilization you tried to erase. My grandmother stood in this chamber and warned you. She told you that humans don't forgive. She told you that the price would come due. That day has arrived. The Archon of the Vrelian conquered, the same crystalline being who had presided over humanity's condemnation, shifted uncomfortably on its platform. The Zinthkar situation was regrettable, but it was handled within the bounds of galactic law. The Council sees no reason for further conflict. Galactic law, Chen repeated, his voice hardening. Let's talk about your laws. The Primitive Species Relocation Act was created 8,000 years ago, ostensibly to help developing civilizations integrate into galactic society. But what it really does is provide legal cover for slavery. Since its creation, 47 species have been relocated. Only 12 of those species still exist as independent civilizations. Would you like to know what happened to the other 35? Chen activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber. Images appeared, documentation of species that had been worked to extinction, cultures that had been eradicated, civilizations that had disappeared into the labor forces of more powerful empires. The Council knew, Chen continued, every member species here has access to the same records I'm showing you. Yet for 8,000 years you maintained this law. Do you know why? Because it was profitable. Because it was convenient. Because you could take what you wanted from weaker species and call it legal. A representative from the Matharian collective, a being of flowing liquid contained in a force field, spoke up. The human raises valid concerns about historical injustices, but bringing them before the Council is the proper way to address them. This military posturing serves no purpose. Military posturing? Chen laughed, but there was no humor in it. This isn't posturing. This is the only language you understand. Let me be clear about what humanity demands. Every species that voted to enslave us will pay reparations. You will open your archives and provide us with documentation of every decision, every vote, every policy that led to our destruction. You will submit to independent investigations of your treatment of all species under your authority, and you will dismantle the Primitive Species Relocation Act. Impossible, several council members said simultaneously. Nothing is impossible when your alternatives are worse, Chen replied. Let me show you what we've discovered about each of you. The holographic display changed, and the council members saw information they had thought was buried and protected. Secret intelligence files, hidden financial records, documentation of crimes that violated even their own laws. The Vrelian conquered had been using relocated species in genetic experiments. The Matharian collective had been harvesting rare biological materials from subject species without consent. The Stellar Federation had been fighting a quiet war of extermination against a minor species whose system contained valuable resources. On and on the revelations went, each one more damning than the last. How did you get this information? The Archon demanded, its crystalline structure flickering with distress. We've been in your systems for years, Chen said simply. Every ship we repaired, every computer network we maintained, every communications relay we serviced. You scattered us across the galaxy and gave us access to all of your infrastructure. Did you really think we were just working? We were learning. We were listening. We were recording everything. A representative from the Stellar Federation, a reptilian being with iridescent scales, tried to salvage the situation. Even if these allegations are true, bringing them to light will destabilize the entire galactic community. The chaos would affect billions of beings across thousands of worlds. Yes, Chen agreed. It will, unless the Council acts first. You have a choice. You can work with us to reform these systems peacefully, or we can broadcast everything we know to every species in the galaxy and let them decide how to respond. How many of your subject species do you think will remain loyal when they learn the truth? The council chamber erupted in argument. Species accused each other of worse crimes. Alliances that had lasted millennia showed signs of strain. Chen simply stood in the center of the chaos, waiting. The keepers, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. Their representative's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. The council will vote on the human proposals. A simple majority will suffice. This is absurd, the Archon protested. We cannot let a primitive species dictate terms to civilizations that predate their recorded history. They are no longer primitive, the keeper replied. They have proven themselves capable of learning, adapting, and fighting for their survival. These are the qualities we claim to value in all sapient species. The question is whether we meant what we said, or whether our laws only applied to those too weak to challenge us. The vote took 3 days. During that time, human ships appeared at key locations throughout Council space. They didn't attack, but their presence was unmistakable, a reminder that humanity was not making empty threats. In the end, 8 Council species voted in favor of humanity's demands. 3 voted against. The keepers, as always, voted with humanity. The measures passed, but Chen was not finished. There's one more thing, he said when the voting concluded. Those species that voted against these reforms, we have a special message for you. The holographic display activated again, this time showing the military readiness of the human fleet. the locations of their hidden shipyards, the full extent of their technological capabilities. It was an intelligence report that should have been classified at the highest level. Chen was broadcasting it to the entire council. "We want you to know exactly what you're facing," Chen explained, "because we're giving you a choice. You can comply with the council's decision or you can fight. But if you fight, you need to understand what that means. The Zinthkar were the architects of our enslavement. You are the enablers. We've already broken the architects. The enablers will be easier." The three species that had voted against the reforms were the Vrelian Concord, the Metharian Collective, and the Dravix Empire. Within a week, all three had sent diplomatic envoys to negotiate directly with humanity. They agreed to the council's terms and added their own additional reparations. The Archon itself requested a private meeting with Admiral Chen. The crystalline being looked diminished somehow, its light less brilliant than Chen remembered from old recordings. "I remember your grandmother," the Archon said. "I dismissed her warning as primitive emotion. I was wrong." "Yes, you were," Chen replied without sympathy. "I want you to understand that I believed we were acting in humanity's best interest." The Archon continued. "We thought you needed guidance, protection from yourselves." "You thought we were inferior," Chen corrected. "You thought you could use us and discard us and we'd never be able to respond. You were wrong about that too. What happens now?" The Archon asked. "Will your people be satisfied with these reforms, or is this merely the beginning of a larger war?" Chen was silent for a long moment. "That depends on you. On all of you. If the council honors its commitments, if the reforms are real and lasting, then we'll have peace. But if you try to return to the old ways, if you think you can wait us out and go back to exploiting weaker species, then you'll learn just how patient humans can be. We waited 47 years for this. We can wait another 47 if we need to." The reforms began immediately. The Primitive Species Relocation Act was repealed. All species currently under protective custody were granted independence and reparations. A new oversight committee was formed, with equal representation from major and minor species to prevent future abuses. But the real changes happened in ways that couldn't be codified into law. The Galactic Council's authority had been challenged and found wanting. Across the galaxy, subject species looked at humanity's example and began asking questions about their own situations. Some demanded reforms. Others demanded independence. The carefully constructed order that had kept the council species in power for millennia began to crack. The Zinthkar Collective, meanwhile, splintered completely. Skritchix, the administrator who had overseen human labor operations, was arrested by his own people and handed over to human authorities. He stood trial in a courtroom on a reclaimed Earth, charged with crimes against sapient beings. The trial lasted 6 months. Thousands of humans testified about their treatment under Zinthkar rule. Skritchix listened to stories of families torn apart, of casual cruelty, of systematic dehumanization. At the end, when asked if he had anything to say in his defense, the old Zinthkar could only repeat what he'd told himself for decades. "It was legal. Everything we did was legal." The judge, a human woman who had been born on a mining station and had watched her parents work themselves to death, looked at Skritchix with cold eyes. "Legality is not morality. You hid behind the law while committing atrocities. The law has now caught up to you." Skritchix was sentenced to life imprisonment. He would spend the rest of his days in a cell, working in conditions similar to those he had imposed on humans. It was poetic justice, though some argued it was too lenient. Earth itself began the long process of recovery. The Zinthkar had stripped the planet of resources and poisoned its ecosystems. Restoration would take generations, but humans approached the task with the same patient determination they had shown in preparing their revenge. Marcus Rivera returned to Earth to help with the terraforming efforts. He was 70 years old now, ancient by the standards of the life he'd led. He stood in what had once been a forest in North America, looking at the scorched earth and thinking about all the years his family had been denied this world. His grandson David worked beside him, planting gene-modified trees designed to rapidly restore the soil. "Do you think we did the right thing?" David asked. It was a question he'd asked before, but this time the context was different. Now they were looking at the consequences of their actions. "I think we did what we had to do," Marcus replied. The council species spent millennia building a system that benefited them at the expense of everyone else. Someone had to break that system. It happened to be us. But look at the chaos. David gestured to the holographic news feeds showing protests and revolutions across a dozen systems. The galaxy is coming apart. No, Marcus said firmly. The galaxy is being put together properly. For the first time, minor species have a voice. For the first time, the powerful are being held accountable. That's not chaos. That's justice. Admiral Chen, now recognized as the leader of humanity's military forces, addressed the human population in a galaxy-wide broadcast 6 months after the council reforms were implemented. We set out to make them pay for what they did to us, Chen said. We've accomplished that goal. The Zinthkar Collective is broken. The council has been reformed. The laws that allowed our enslavement have been repealed, but our work isn't finished. We have an opportunity now to build something better, to create a galactic community where no species will ever suffer what we suffered. That's the real victory, not revenge but transformation. Not everyone agreed with Chen's vision. A faction of humans led by hardliners who had suffered the worst abuses argued for continuing the military campaign. They wanted to see every council species reduced to the same level of powerlessness that humanity had experienced. They deserve it, a woman named Rodriguez argued in public forums. Every single one of them benefited from our suffering. They should feel what we felt. But Chen and the majority of human leaders argued against perpetual warfare. If we become what they were, we've lost everything that makes us human, Chen said. We fought for justice, not for the right to become oppressors ourselves. The debate raged across human communities, a reflection of the trauma that decades of enslavement had inflicted. In the end, humanity chose the harder path. They would pursue justice, but not vengeance. They would hold the council species accountable, but not destroy them. They would build a better system, not just tear down the old one. The Keepers watched all of this with approval. Their representative met with Admiral Chen one final time before humanity began establishing its permanent place in galactic society. We voted against your enslavement because we saw what you could become, the Keeper said. Not conquerors or destroyers, but something more valuable. Catalysts for change. You've exceeded even our expectations. Why didn't you help us earlier? Chen asked. You could have intervened. You could have stopped the Zinthkar. If we had, you would have remained dependent on us, the Keeper replied. You needed to save yourselves. You needed to prove to the galaxy and to yourselves that you were capable of standing equal to any species. Now you have. The meeting ended and Chen returned to his fleet. There was still work to do. Reparations to collect, systems to patrol, a new order to build and maintain. But for the first time since humanity had reached for the stars, they were doing it as free people, as equals, as a species that had earned its place through courage and patience. The price had come due and the galaxy had paid it. Now came the harder task of making sure the same debts never accumulated again. The Galactic Council War, as historians would later call it, began exactly 3 months after the reforms were passed. 8 council species, unable to accept the loss of their privileged position, formed a military alliance and declared the reforms null and void. They claimed that humanity had coerced the council through threats and intimidation, and they would restore the proper order of galactic civilization. Admiral James Chen received the declaration aboard his flagship while overseeing the restoration of a human colony world. He read the message twice, then called his senior staff together. They didn't learn, he said, his voice carrying more disappointment than anger. After everything we showed them, after all the evidence of their crimes, they still think they can go back to the old ways. What are our orders? His tactical officer asked. Commander Sarah Rodriguez had been born on a mining station and had fought in the initial actions against the Zinthkar. She'd seen more combat than most of the human fleet combined. We show them why that's impossible, Chen replied, but we do it smart. We don't just defeat them. We make it so complete, so total, that no one will ever think about trying this again. The 8 species that formed the Resistance Alliance were formidable. Together, they commanded fleets numbering in the tens of thousands of ships. They controlled hundreds of systems and could draw on populations in the trillions. By any conventional calculation, humanity was hopelessly outnumbered. But conventional calculations didn't account for what humanity had become. The scattered slaves had transformed into a unified civilization that combined the best of human ingenuity with technology adapted from a dozen alien species. More importantly, they weren't alone. 4 council species sided with humanity, including the enigmatic Keepers. And across the galaxy, minor species that had suffered under Council rule rallied to the human banner. The first battle of the war took place at a system called Vrel 7, a major shipyard for the Vrelian conquered. The Vrelians had assembled a defensive fleet of 3,000 ships, confident that their superior numbers and position would allow them to repel any human attack. They were wrong. The human fleet didn't engage in traditional battle. Instead, they jumped into the system at multiple points simultaneously, their drives allowing precision that should have been impossible. Each human ship knew exactly where to be, exactly when to fire, their movements coordinated by quantum communication networks that the Vrelians couldn't jam or intercept. The battle lasted 4 hours. The Vrelians lost 2/3 of their fleet. The humans lost 41 ships. But more devastating than the military defeat was what happened next. Human boarding teams captured the shipyard facilities intact, and what they found in the computers shocked even those who thought they knew the full extent of Council crimes. The Vrelians had been using subject species not just for labor, but for biological experimentation. Genetic modification attempts that resulted in horrific suffering, forced breeding programs, vivisection studies. The documentation was extensive, clinical, and absolutely damning. Chen broadcast it all. Every image, every report, every communication that showed Vrelian administrators discussing their experiments as casually as humans might discuss crop yields. The galaxy watched in horror as one of the Council's oldest and most respected civilizations was revealed as perpetrators of systematic atrocities. "This is what we're fighting against," Chen said in his broadcast. "This is what the Council species want to preserve. Not civilization, not order, the right to treat other sapient beings as objects for their use." The revelation changed the nature of the war. Species that had been neutral suddenly declared for humanity. The Vrelian Concord found itself diplomatically isolated, its allies in the Resistance Alliance suddenly reluctant to be associated with such obvious evil. But the war continued. The Metherian Collective, whose liquid-based biology made them difficult opponents, launched a counteroffensive that caught human forces off guard. Their ships could reshape themselves in ways that conventional vessels couldn't match, and their weapons used exotic physics that human shields weren't designed to counter. The Metherians retook 3 systems before humanity adapted. Human engineers working with allied species developed new shield configurations. Tacticians learned to predict Metherian shape-shifting patterns. Within 6 weeks, the Metherian advance had stalled, and within 3 months it had been reversed. Marcus Rivera, now 72 years old, worked around the clock to upgrade human drives and power systems. His grandson David had become an engineering prodigy in his own right, and together they pushed human technology to new limits. "We're going to burn ourselves out," David warned after 72 hours of continuous work. "We're both too old for this pace." Marcus laughed, though it turned into a cough. "I've been too old for this since the day I was born into slavery. Age doesn't matter. Only results matter." They developed a new drive system that could jump ships directly into close proximity with enemy vessels, allowing for devastating surprise attacks. The first time it was used, a human strike force appeared within the shields of a Metherian command ship and destroyed it before the Metherians could react. The innovation spread through the human fleet within days. Suddenly, no enemy position was safe. No fleet concentration could be maintained. The Resistance Alliance found itself fighting an opponent that could strike anywhere, anytime, with precision that bordered on prescient. On Earth, the restoration continued, even as the war raged. Humans had learned to multitask over decades of survival, and they applied that skill to rebuilding while fighting. Forests were replanted. Oceans were cleansed. Cities rose from the ruins, built with a combination of human architecture and alien technology. Sarah Chen's memorial was completed in what had once been called Washington, D.C. The structure was simple but powerful, a stone pillar bearing her final words to the Council. "Humans don't forgive. You've been warned." It became a place of pilgrimage for humans across the galaxy, a reminder of where they had come from and why they fought. The turning point of the war came at the Battle of Council Prime, the system that housed the original Council chambers. The Resistance Alliance had fortified the system heavily, assembling a fleet of 15,000 ships to defend what they considered the symbolic heart of galactic civilization. Admiral Chen, brought the full might of the human fleet to bear. 2,000 human ships supported by allied forces that brought the total to nearly 4,000 vessels. They were still outnumbered, but Chen had learned something crucial from studying galactic history. The Council species hadn't fought a real war in centuries. They had forgotten what desperation looked like, what true commitment meant. Humanity remembered. Every human in that fleet had lost family to the Zinthkar. Everyone carried the weight of decades of suffering. They fought not for conquest but for vindication, and that made all the difference. The battle raged for 3 days. Space around Council Prime became a graveyard of shattered ships and expanding debris fields. The Resistance Alliance threw everything they had at the human fleet, tactics and weapons refined over millennia. It wasn't enough. Human ships darted through the defensive formations, their drives and tactics creating chaos in the enemy ranks. Human captains made decisions in seconds that should have taken hours of calculation. They fought like people who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. When the Resistance Alliance finally broke and retreated, they'd lost 11,000 ships. The human losses were devastating too. Nearly 800 vessels and tens of thousands of lives. But they held the field. They held Council Prime. Chen led a landing party to the council chambers themselves. The great ring of platforms still floated in that vast space, though now the walls showed scars from nearby ship battles. Chen walked to the center of the circle, to the exact spot where his grandmother had stood. This building represents 8,000 years of the Galactic Council's authority, Chen said, his words being broadcast across the galaxy. 8,000 years of accumulated power, wisdom, and privilege. It also represents 8,000 years of accumulated crimes, the enslavement of 47 species, the exploitation of hundreds more, wars fought for profit, populations relocated for convenience, all of it legal. All of it sanctioned by the beings who stood on these platforms and called themselves civilized. He paused, looking around at the empty platforms. The council members had fled as the battle turned against them. This building is now closed. The Galactic Council as an institution is dissolved. In its place, we will build something new. Something better. A federation where all sapient species have equal voice, where power comes from consent rather than force, where the mistakes of the past cannot be repeated. The remaining Resistance Alliance species surrendered within 2 weeks. The terms were harsh but not genocidal. They would free all subject species under their control. They would submit to oversight councils that included representatives from those they had oppressed. They would pay reparations that would fund the rebuilding of destroyed civilizations. And they would do it all under the watchful eyes of humanity and its allies. The Archon of the Vrelian Concord was among those who surrendered personally. The ancient being appeared before a tribunal that included humans, keepers, and representatives from a dozen species that had been victimized by council policies. I am guilty, the Archon said simply, not because I personally ordered atrocities, but because I allowed them to happen. I saw the suffering caused by our policies and convinced myself it was necessary. I was wrong. I have no defense. The tribunal sentenced the Archon to permanent exile from Vrelian space. It would spend the rest of its extremely long life working to restore the species its people had harmed. It was a sentence the Archon accepted without protest. Skritchix, watching from his cell where he served his own sentence, felt a moment of vindication. At least he wasn't alone in his guilt. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by the same emptiness that had filled him since his conviction. He had spent his life believing in the righteousness of the collective, in the natural order of powerful species guiding weaker ones. That belief had been torn away, leaving nothing but the knowledge of his own complicity in evil. The new Federation, which humanity insisted on calling the Galactic Assembly to distinguish it from the old Council, held its first session in a newly constructed station. The station was deliberately modest, designed to remind everyone that government was a service, not a display of power. Every sapient species in the known galaxy received an invitation to send representatives. Over 300 species attended the first session, far more than had ever been part of the old council. The chamber was noisy, chaotic, full of arguments and passionate debates. It was beautiful. Admiral Chen gave the opening address. He was 56 years old now, gray-haired and bearing scars from the war. My grandmother stood before the old council and asked for recognition of human sovereignty. She was denied. Today we stand here not to ask for recognition but to offer it. Every species here has equal standing. Every voice deserves to be heard. We will make mistakes. We will have disagreements, but we will make those mistakes together, as equals. The Assembly's first act was to establish the Sapient Rights Charter, a document that codified protections for all intelligent species. No more relocation acts, no more protective custody, no more convenient laws that allowed the powerful to exploit the weak. Every species had the right to its home system, to its own development to determine its own future. The second act was to establish the Restoration Fund, financed by reparations from the old council species, but managed by representatives from victimized populations. The fund would help rebuild civilizations that had been damaged or destroyed by council policies. Earth was one of many recipients. Over the following years, Earth transformed. The poisoned oceans were cleaned using bioengineered microorganisms developed by allied scientists. The stripped forests returned, grown from seed banks that humans had hidden during the initial invasion. Cities rose that combined the best of human design with technologies learned from a dozen species. Marcus Rivera lived to see grass growing in the field where he'd been born, though that field was on a mining station light years from Earth. He made one final trip to the home planet, walking through restored forests and breathing air that smelled like his ancestors had described it. He was 78 years old, ancient by the standards of someone who had spent most of his life in harsh conditions. "We did it," he said to his grandson David as they stood looking at a sunset over a restored lake. "We actually did it." "We did," David agreed. "Though I'm not sure what it is. We didn't just win a war. We changed everything." "That was always the point," Marcus replied. "If we just wanted revenge, we could have glassed the Zinthkar homeworld and called it done. But Grandma Sarah didn't want revenge. She wanted justice. And justice meant changing the system that allowed our suffering in the first place." Marcus died 3 months later, peacefully in his sleep on Earth. He was buried in a cemetery that overlooked the Pacific Ocean, in soil that his family had walked on before the Zinthkar came. His grave marker bore a simple inscription. He remembered. He endured. He came home. Admiral Chen retired from active military service on the 10th anniversary of the war's end. He'd accomplished what 3 generations of his family had worked toward. The Zinthkar were broken. The council was reformed. Humanity had its place among the stars, earned through courage and determination. But Chen didn't retire to leisure. He took a position in the Galactic Assembly, working to make sure the new institutions lived up to their promises. He'd learned that building was harder than destroying, that maintaining peace required more effort than waging war. 20 years after humanity's first strike against the Zinthkar, a new species was discovered on the galactic rim. The Talaran were a species just beginning to send radio signals into space, their civilization at roughly the same level humanity had been at first contact. The Galactic Assembly debated how to approach them. Some argued for immediate contact. Others wanted to wait and observe. Chen listened to the arguments, remembering another debate half a century earlier. "We should extend peaceful contact," Chen said when it was his turn to speak. "We should recognize their sovereignty over their home system immediately. We should offer assistance without strings attached. And we should make it absolutely clear that they have the same rights as any other species in the galaxy." But the old protocols required a probationary period. A representative from one of the former council species objected. Some evaluation of their readiness. Chen's response was quiet but firm. "The old protocols enslaved my people and 46 others. The old protocols are why we fought a war. If we're returning to those ways, even in spirit, then we've learned nothing." The Assembly voted unanimously to extend recognition to the Talaran. First contact was made by a joint team that included humans, keepers, and representatives from a dozen other species. The message was simple. "Welcome to the galactic community. You are our equals. We offer friendship without conditions." The Talaran, overwhelmed but grateful, accepted. They would join the Galactic Assembly as full members, their voice equal to species that had been traveling the stars for millennia. It was a statement of principles, a demonstration that the new order was fundamentally different from what had come before. On Earth, in the memorial to Sarah Chen, someone added a new inscription below her warning to the old council. It read, "The price was paid. The lesson was learned. The future begins here." Admiral Chen visited the memorial on what would be his last trip to Earth. He was 73 years old, still sharp but feeling the weight of his years. He stood before his grandmother's memorial and spoke to her as if she could hear him. "We did what you asked," he said quietly. "We remembered. We didn't forgive. We made them pay for what they did. But more importantly, we made sure it couldn't happen again. Not to us, not to anyone. I think that's what you really wanted. Not revenge, but change." He placed a hand on the stone, feeling the carved words beneath his fingers. "The galaxy is different now, Grandma. Better, it's not perfect. We still have problems, still have conflicts. But the fundamental things have changed. No more slavery hiding behind legal language. No more powerful species treating weaker ones as resources. Everyone has a voice now. Everyone matters." Chen left the memorial and returned to his work in the Galactic Assembly. There were always new challenges, always problems to solve. But they were the problems of a free people working together, not the problems of slaves struggling to survive. Humanity had come home, not just to Earth, but to a place in the galaxy that they'd earned through suffering and determination. They'd been pushed to the edge of extinction and had come back stronger. They'd been told they were primitive and had proven themselves equal to the oldest civilizations. They'd been enslaved and had freed themselves while freeing others. Most importantly, they'd been warned that their actions would have consequences, and they'd made sure those consequences came due. The old council species had scattered humanity across the stars, thinking it would make them easier to control. Instead, they'd created a network that would eventually strangle them. They'd tried to break the human spirit and had forged it into something stronger. The galaxy had learned the lesson Sarah Chen had tried to teach them 50 years earlier. When you wrong a species, when you push them to the edge, when you dismiss their warnings and their pain, you better hope you finish the job. Because if they survive, they'll remember. They'll adapt. They'll come back. And humans, as the galaxy had learned to its cost, don't forgive. The lesson would echo through galactic civilization for generations to come. In the Galactic Assembly, whenever a conflict arose between powerful and weak species, someone would inevitably reference the human example. "Remember what happened to the Council," they would say. "Remember what happens when the powerful abuse the weak." It became the foundation of the new order. Not fear of human military might, though that remained considerable, but fear of what any species could become if pushed too far. If their warnings were ignored, if their suffering was dismissed, the price had come due and the galaxy was better for it.